Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to make foam buildings. The architecture known as the half-timbered style is a popular subject for model building. And this is for good reason. Being European, this architecture is a little exotic to most North American model builders, and it is, most importantly, timeless. This makes it equally at home in a medieval fantasy setting or in the modern day. Over the years, the half-timbered style has become synonymous with urban areas in Dungeons & Dragons and other miniature gaming and role-playing settings. It also works pretty well for my napoleonics. In terms of visual interest, it also does not get any better than the half-timber style. Most buildings are portrayed with tons of almost random additions that make the building look whimsical and weathered. A couple weeks ago, I was contacted by a client to produce a table full of half-timbered buildings for his miniature games rendered in about 28mm scale. As a form of architecture that I love, I have some experience building in this style, so I jumped at the chance. Now in this project, I'll be building lots of types, from the very simple to the pretty complex. But I thought it would be interesting to provide an example of how I build these, should you want to do something similar. Best of all, the main materials are insulation foam, cardstock, and balsa wood, so there's nothing too technical about these builds. So, sit back and check out my process for building foam half-timbered buildings. Like all good projects, I started out with a plan. I knew I wanted to make each building roughly 6.5 inches long by 6 inches tall by about 5 inches wide. This worked pretty well in combination with the models that I would be using with it. Once this was done, I got out some sheets of insulation foam. Now, in this case, I had the gray stuff, but any color would work. I cut a basic block to the dimensions of the house, less the gables for the roof. Once I had the blocks cut out, I glued them together with hot glue to make them the right height. I wanted to break up the roofline on this model by adding a sort of central tower, so I made another block of styrofoam that was 2 inches wide, 2 inches deep, and about 3.5 inches tall. I used an old model builder's trick and put double-ended pointy toothpicks into the bottom of it to help reinforce the bond. Then I applied some hot glue and fixed it in place. Next, I grabbed my metal ruler and a sheet of 5mm wide black foam core. I measure out the dimensions of the front and back walls and also the sides. I transfer these onto the foam core. I make sure that I make each piece of foam core about 5mm wider than it needs to be to make up for the gaps when I glue them onto the side walls. Then, getting out my mat cutter, I cut a 45-degree angle into the end of each piece. This will help the walls mate together better. Taking some windows and doors that I had printed previously on my 3D printer, I ruled out where they would go on each wall. I then cut the holes in each wall section so that they would fit. After making these cuts, I also peeled the paper off the outside of the foam core. This exposed the center foam layer. I did this so that I could expose the texture. I always found that the texture on the inside of the foam makes a really convincing texture for the wall facings on a building. To accentuate the windows, or to cover up any gaps around the windows and doors that happened when I was cutting the foam, I then went ahead and just hot glued some matchsticks into place around them. I cut these to length to imply the frames. With this complete, it was now time to glue the walls to the styrofoam block itself. A hallmark of an experienced model builder is that they go to great efforts to add as much texture as possible. A lot of people underestimate the importance of having a variety of different textures in their pieces. This creates a ton of visual interest that you wouldn't get if all of the materials you used were exactly the same. To do this, I decided that I wanted to add a little bit of exposed stonework to the model. This is a pretty easy effect to achieve. I took out a pen and just went ahead and scribed a whole bunch of stones into the styrofoam block itself. At this point, I was ready to tackle the gables of the building. Now, one of the things that half-timber buildings are known for is really complex exposed trusses on the gable sides. And I honestly didn't really want to take weeks and weeks cutting specific angles into balsa wood to make all of the unique woodwork. So instead, I did what most model builders would do in my situation. I designed it in Tinkercad. After designing a couple different truss sizes and types, with a variety of different angles cut into it, I went ahead and 3D printed these. Now going back to my model, I cut a triangle that was the same width of the building and was about 3 inches high to create a high peaked roof. I peeled off the paper to expose the foam beneath, and then using super glue, I glued each of the individual trusses right to the foam. Returning to my hot glue, I went ahead and glued the gables to the building itself. The sides that had the trusses on them went to the exterior, and the ones that I built that were blank went to the interior. I used some cutoffs of rectangular foam core behind the trusses at the edges to help reinforce them so they'd be stronger. Now comes the step where I need to add the timber framing. And here I also needed to look at a couple practical considerations. Basically, I need to build 10 of these buildings, and timber frame buildings have, well, a lot of timber on them. If I wanted to make them look completely realistic, I would basically be cutting balsa wood forever. Now, I don't mind a little hard work, but spending 30 years cutting balsa wood will probably take its toll on me. So instead, I cut out just enough pieces to imply that the building was timber frame without cluttering up the surface too much. In the end, though, I think it gave the appropriate result. I cut out strips of balsa wood using my miter box, being careful to match the angles as best as I could, and then hot glued them to the surface of the foam core. It was now time to start thinking about preparing the roof line. First, I needed something to stick my shingles to, so I took out some heavy cardstock and cut out some rectangles. I glued these down over the gables to form a peaked roof. After this, then I needed to get to work on making the shingles themselves. If you've built miniature shingles before, you know that this job, well, sucks, because you always need a lot, and it's a fiddly process. I started by taking out a paper cutter and going to a heavier cardstock. I took the cardstock and cut it into strips. After this was done, I then cut into each strip about half the length up the slice. With this complete, I peeled back every other shingle and cut one slightly shorter, so then I had a strip with staggered lengths. Getting out my hot glue, I then began to glue these in strips to the roof. Where there was any overlap, I cut them off. With the roof now well in hand, I decided it was time to finish the central tower. I cut some decorative blocks out of styrofoam and glued them down to the top. Getting out some toothpicks, I stuck them into the four corners and left them coming out the top to make it look decorative. You know, spiky things on your roof always helps your house look classy. Then, taking out a pen, I textured the stonework just like I did with the rest of the building. As a final step to prepare the building before painting, I took out my handy crumpled up ball of tinfoil and rolled it back and forth over all the rock areas. This would just impart a little more shape to the rock to make it look convincing. When I had finished this, it was now time to prime. I got out some matte Mod Podge, mixed it with about 1/3 black paint and 1/3 water, and then went ahead and brushed it heavily on over the building. This takes a while, but it's a very important step. The Mod Podge protects the styrofoam from other chemicals that you might use while painting, and it also makes the building very durable. After I'd given the Mod Podge and black paint mixture 24 hours to dry, I could then move on to painting the rest of the model. I started with the roof. I dry brushed it in shades of brown and red and worked my way up till I was finally adding about 30% off-white to about 70% red acrylic paint. I gave this a really light dry brush to make sure that everything stood out and was properly highlighted. With this done, I could focus on the walls. I got out my airbrush, added some camouflage medium brown to it, and went over any of the areas that would not be covered in stone. Moving to the plastered areas between the timbers. And I guess this is plaster? I'm not really sure what it's supposed to be. I take out my sand paint, put it in my airbrush, and spray it in lightly. I try to spray more directly on the areas where the sun will be hitting the middle of the panels, and taper it off, feathering it out towards the edges, keeping it dark around the timbers themselves. With that in place, I can look at the timbers. I dry brush them old wood, and then move up to a dry brush of off-white. I focus on the off-white towards the edges to provide a highlight. The stonework hasn't had any attention yet, so I turn to that. And this is pretty easy because the Mod Podge, since it's tinted black to begin with, provides a base layer. All I need to do is grab some light gray paint and give it all a light dry brush. Speaking of dry brushing, it's pretty obvious why I'm relying heavily on dry brushing in this project. This building is big, and so dry brushing is really the most efficient way to try to bring out the highlights without having to go in and rely on the time-intensive method of layer painting. That being said, as always, a lot of successive layers of dry brushing kills your contrast. So it's now time to line in. Again, lining in is just bringing out the detail of the deeper places and the shadowed areas on your models by putting a darker color paint in. In this case, I've used enamels. Their low surface tension lets capillary action draw the paint for you into some of the crevices. This saves you time. Grabbing my trusty Tamiya panel liner, I use the brush applicator that comes with it and just go ahead and run it all into the gaps in the stonework and along the edges of the timber frame. Once this is dried, it's created a much more accentuated layer of shadows that adds depth and volume to the building. Because I figured this house was in a fairly harsh urban environment, it now needed some weathering. As always, I decided to use my weathering pencils by AK Interactive. If you've not used weathering pencils before, just go out and get some. I've talked about them a lot. They really are just great. By wetting the tip, I then go on and apply blobs of dark green, light green, gray, and other earth tones all over the building. Then with a moist brush, I just go in and gently feather these out, blending them into the surface. This will imply all sorts of different blemishes, such as rust, accumulated dust, rain streaks, and mud. With this done, now I need to protect all my work, and I just go ahead and give the model a couple coats of matte varnish. And with that, this project is done. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is your source for miniature, terrain building, and diorama content, and we can't do it without your support. We want to build a community to ensure that the wonderful art of building a miniature is accessible to everybody. To participate, please consider joining on Patreon. For $4 a month, our Patreon members benefit from 10% off at Joe Saunders Terrain in the Etsy store, 5% off paints and hobby supplies at Torchlight Games, free access to STL files, a mention in our credits, and early access to our videos. Please check it out and consider joining. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please remember to subscribe, press the bell button so you get immediate notification on our videos, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.